Early Sunday morning, a moderate earthquake shook a stretch of mountains north of Los Angeles, and within hours, acclaim was spreading everywhere. This quake had struck the exact junction where two of California's most dangerous fault lines collide. That claim turned out to be wrong. And the real story, the one seismologists are actually telling, is more interesting and more useful to understand than the version that went viral. Here's what's actually confirmed. At 3:38 a.m., local time on July 12, 2026, an earthquake struck about a mile east-southeast of Fraser Park, California, roughly 70 miles north of Los Angeles, at a depth of somewhere between 8 and 13 kilometers, depending on which agency's measurement you use. A magnitude 4.1 earthquake shook the Fraser Park area early Sunday morning, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. The initial USGS reading came in at magnitude 4.1, with some outlets reporting 4.2 in the first hours. A later Shake Alert system summary, drawing on dozens of regional seismic stations, revised the number up slightly to 4.4. The quake originated at about 3:38 a.m. local time and registered a final system magnitude of 4.4. That kind of adjustment in the hours after a quake is completely normal and doesn't change anything about what the event actually represents. The shaking was felt widely, as far as Santa Barbara, San Diego, and even Orange County, with over 770 people submitting felt reports to the USGS system. A total of 774 people reported feeling the shake using the USGS's Did You Feel It reporting tool. There were no injuries and no significant damage. Now here's the part that matters most, and it's the part that got skipped over in a lot of the fastest coverage. Fraser Park sits in genuinely complicated terrain. The San Andreas Fault runs just southwest of the town, and the Garlock Fault lies to the east, with a lesser-known fault called the Plato Fault running through the immediate area as well. Because the epicenter landed so close to where all of these systems interact, speculation spread almost immediately that the quake had struck directly at the historic junction between the San Andreas and the Garlock, one of the most closely watched fault intersections in the entire state. Speculation quickly spread online that the earthquake occurred at a critical junction between the San Andreas and Garlock faults. The Southern California Seismic Network's actual analysis says otherwise. Their assessment concluded the quake was most likely associated with the Plato Fault, a smaller, less prominent fault line, not the San Andreas or the Garlock directly. The report from the Southern California Seismic Network shows the earthquake does not appear to have impacted either of the nearby major faults. Instead, scientists say the event was likely linked to movement along the Plato Fault. So let's be precise, because precision is exactly what got lost in the rush to publish this story fast. This was not a quake on the San Andreas. It was not a quake on the Garlock. It was a moderate earthquake on a smaller connected fault sitting inside a genuinely complex tangle of fault systems that all meet in the same general area. A USGS scientist described the geology of that region memorably. Picture the crust as a shattered windshield, broken into pieces by the intense compression of two major fault systems squeezing against each other, with the Plato Fault as one of many smaller cracks running through that shattered zone. Imagine it's just sort of stuck, and it's like a traffic jam. So what's happening is the crust has shattered. It's broken into many pieces. Think of a shattered windshield with all different shards. Seismologists were clear on this point too. Earthquakes of this size are relatively common across Southern California, and this one does not, on its own, indicate a larger earthquake is imminent. Seismologists say the event was likely linked to movement along the Plato Fault, do not necessarily indicate a larger earthquake is imminent. So does that mean the story is nothing? Not quite. And here's where the real, still legitimate context comes in, because the broader concern about this region wasn't invented for a headline. It's based on actual published research, and it's worth understanding on its own terms rather than tying it to a single small earthquake that turned out to be on the wrong fault. Just weeks before this Fraser Park quake, researchers, including a team from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, published a study modeling roughly 1,000 years of earthquake activity across the southern San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems. Their conclusion: current stress levels across those systems are now at or above anything recorded across the past 1,000 years of geological history. A June study modeling 1,000 years of earthquakes found that stress on parts of the southern San Andreas and San Jacinto systems is at or above levels seen in the past millennium. The study specifically highlighted a location called Cajon Pass, describing it as an earthquake gate, a structural pinch point that determines whether a future rupture stays contained to a single fault or jumps across and links up with a neighboring fault system, growing into something significantly larger than either fault could produce on its own. The Cajon Pass as an earthquake gate that can influence whether a rupture stays confined to a single fault or propagates to adjoining systems. That's a genuinely important shift in how seismologists think about worst-case scenarios in this region. Older models often treated the San Andreas and San Jacinto as separate systems capable of independent contained earthquakes. This research suggests, under the right stress conditions, that separation might not hold. Layer onto that the fact that this isn't an isolated concern for just one corner of the state. Earlier in June, a magnitude 5.6 earthquake struck near Redwood Valley in Mendocino County, up in Northern California, causing localized damage and knocking out power for thousands of customers. A magnitude 5.6 quake near Redwood Valley in Mendocino County on June 24th produced localized damage and pockets of outages. That's several hundred miles from Fraser Park, on an entirely different piece of the state's fault network. And it's part of why 2026 has already stood out as a year of elevated seismic attention across California generally, not just around one fault junction. And the Garlock Fault itself, regardless of whether Sunday's quake actually touched it, remains a legitimately overdue system worth understanding on its own. Paleoseismic evidence, physical traces of ancient ruptures preserved in layers of soil and rock, shows the Garlock has produced major earthquakes involving several meters of displacement, consistent with something in the range of magnitude 7.5. But there's no record of an earthquake that large happening on the Garlock within the entire period we've had written or instrumental records. Current estimates put the gap since its last major rupture somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years, meaning stress has had an extraordinarily long runway to accumulate with nowhere to go. And that stress didn't stay flat over recent years either. The 2019 Ridgecrest earthquake sequence, a magnitude 6.44 shock followed by a 7.1 main shock, the strongest, to hit California in over 2 decades at that point, increased accumulated stress on the Garlock Fault by roughly 30%, according to USGS calculations. So the fault was already flagged as overdue before this year even started, and Ridgecrest made that underlying pressure measurably worse. The southern San Andreas carries its own version of this story. Southern California has gone without a major urban earthquake since the Northridge quake struck in 1994, over 3 decades now. Northridge, despite being smaller than the scenarios described in the newer Cajon Pass research, still caused billions of dollars in damage and remains one of the costliest natural disasters in U.S. history. Researchers involved in the recent stress modeling study have said that releasing the level of accumulated stress they identified would likely require an earthquake of magnitude 7 or larger, and that a quake of that size striking the region today could affect close to 24 million people across the greater Los Angeles metro area and the Inland Empire, a population base far larger than what existed in 1994. None of that changes the specific, honest fact about Sunday morning. This particular earthquake was most likely on the Plato Fault, not the San Andreas Garlock Junction, and seismologists have said so clearly and on the record. What it does mean is that the online instinct to treat this quake as the headline event was the wrong instinct, even though the underlying regional concern it got attached to is real, well documented, and worth taking seriously on its own merits. This is actually a useful moment to talk about how earthquake science works day to day, because it's rarely dramatic and rarely as clean as a single viral claim makes it sound. Individual. Earthquakes function less like standalone warnings and more like single data points feeding into a much larger, slower forming picture. Decades of paleoseismic records, recent stress modeling studies, aftershock behavior from earlier ruptures like Ridgecrest, and the Akum specific geology of wherever the next quake happens to strike. A magnitude 4.1 or 4.4 earthquake, correctly identified as being on a smaller fault rather than a major one, still adds to that picture. It just doesn't mean what the fastest version of the story claimed it meant. It's also worth being honest about how quickly online speculation outran the actual seismic analysis here. Within hours of the shaking, before the Southern California Seismic Network had published its assessment, the narrative that this was the Garlock-San Andreas Junction quake was already spreading. That's a pattern worth recognizing generally with breaking seismic news. The first hours after any earthquake are exactly when preliminary data is loosest, magnitudes get revised, and the most dramatic possible interpretation of a location tends to spread fastest, precisely because it hasn't been checked yet. So where does that leave the honest, accurate picture as of today? Southern California sits inside a genuinely complex, heavily stressed fault network. The Garlock Fault remains significantly overdue for a major rupture, independent of anything that happened this weekend. The southern San Andreas has gone an unusually long time without releasing stress directly along its own trace, and recent modeling suggests that stress may now be at record levels for the past 1,000 years. Cajon Pass represents a genuine structural question mark about whether a future rupture could link multiple fault systems into something larger than any one of them could produce alone. And Northern California has already had its own reminder this year, with the Redwood Valley quake in June. All of that is real, current, and worth taking seriously. completely separate from whether Sunday's Fraser Park earthquake happened to land on the fault everyone initially assumed it did. What actually happened at Fraser Park is a moderate, unremarkable earthquake on a lesser-known fault, in a region that happens to sit inside one of the most closely studied and legitimately concerning fault networks in the country. Both of those things are true at the same time, and neither one needs the other exaggerated to be worth paying attention to. If you live anywhere in California, or in any region with meaningful seismic risk, this is still a reasonable moment to check your own preparedness rather than because of this specific quake, but because the broader picture, the overdue Garlock, the record stress levels near Cajon Pass, the fact that Southern California hasn't seen a major urban earthquake since 1994, hasn't changed and won't change regardless of which smaller fault produced Sunday's shaking. A basic emergency kit with several days of food, water, and any needed medical supplies. A plan for where to shelter in your home during shaking, under sturdy furniture, away from windows and anything that could fall. A simple family communication plan, including an out-of-area contact, since local phone networks often get overloaded in the first hour after any significant quake. And signing up for regional early warning alerts, which can occasionally offer several seconds to as much as a minute of advance notice depending on your distance from an epicenter. Enough time in many cases to drop and take cover before the strongest shaking arrives, and enough time for automated systems to slow trains or pause sensitive equipment. What happens next with this specific fault network is genuinely unknown, and any seismologist working this data would tell you the same thing. Earthquake prediction with precise timing simply isn't something current science can do. What is knowable, and what's worth understanding accurately rather than through whatever version spreads fastest online, is exactly what did and didn't happen this weekend, and exactly why the broader concern about this region remains real either way.